In Satisfactory, when it comes to iron, we all think about the obvious connections. However, that's not the full story. What if I told you that you could make iron ingots, iron rods, iron plates, wire, screws, cable, reinforced iron plates, steel pipes, modular frames, rotors, stators, and motors just using iron ore? Well, you can, and today I'll be showing you how. I've got all of these recipes laid out in front of me. We'll be starting off with the easier recipes, then ending on the more complicated ones. Firstly, let's just get iron ingots out the way with. Obviously, you can make iron ingots using iron ore, and for all the examples I'm going to be giving today, we'll be using either 200 iron ore or less. So that's going to be rather important to bear in mind. And of course, using 200 iron ore and combining it with water, which is also something I'm doing today to try and save some iron, we can make 371 iron ingots. However, if you didn't want to use any water and only wanted to use iron ore, you could make a total of 200 iron ingots. But obviously, again, when you add in some water to the mix, you can make a lot more, which means you get more bang for your buck, but you have to get water involved. Regardless, iron ingots is the first recipe that you can make with iron. Another really obvious recipe is iron rods. Again, combine your iron ore with water to make your 371 iron ingots, which then makes your 371 iron rods. Moving on now to our third recipe, and very similar to the iron rods, we are combining 200 iron ore and 114.28 water to make our 371 iron ingots, which then makes 247.3 iron plates. Now moving on to our very final basic recipe, where again you combine the iron ore and the water to make your 371 iron ingots, you can then make 1,484 screws per minute, and I know a lot of us don't like screws. I am also in that category. However, making 1,484 screws just by using some iron and water, that's not too bad. But let's see very quickly how many screws we can make only using 200 iron ore. Well, this is a 1-to-1 ratio, so again, 200 iron ore makes 200 iron ingots, and then 200 iron ingots, when we times this by 10, then gives us 800 screws. This is 684 less screws than if we were to add our water, so that just shows you how important making our pure iron ingots can actually be. I have got an entire video, of course, dedicated to that. So that's essentially a very quick speedrun on the four most obvious iron recipes in Satisfactory. This is where things start to get rather interesting in my opinion. Wire. Obviously, wire is used by making copper, but let's say you don't have copper around, or you might want to use iron wire for a certain project. Well, this is where this particular recipe really comes in handy, because you can make 667 wire per minute using 200 iron ore. In my opinion, this is not too bad, especially again if there's no copper nearby, because this saves you either conveyor belting your copper all the way out to where you are, or of course using a train or a drone, which then costs power, or whatever you're using to power your drones. So this, in my opinion, again, is rather good. But obviously, if we can do wire, then we can do cable. That is right. Again, you're making your 667 wire, which then makes 333.5 cable per minute, using your 200 iron ore and combining your 114.28 water per minute. Both of these recipes are fantastic if you haven't got any copper nearby. But let's say you have got copper nearby and iron, there might be one other resource you might not have nearby, and that resource is coal. Well, luckily, this recipe can massively help you out. Steel pipes. What if you could make steel pipes just completely avoiding coal? Well, you can if you use a recipe called iron pipe, which you can actually make right here in the constructor, rather than the foundry. The only downside that I can see personally with this recipe is the fact that it requires quite a lot of iron itself. For every one steel pipe you make, it requires 4 iron ingots, and obviously the price for that is rather steep. However, I use steel pipes for absolutely everything. Of course, you have to use it to make your SAM fluctuators. You can also use it there to make your explosive rebar, which is my favorite ammo type. We'll talk about this in just a moment, and of course it's used to make a bunch of other recipes down here as well, including the best heavy modular frame recipe in the game. You can also make steel frames with it, and a bunch of other really important stuff, especially the encased industrial pipe, which actually saves you on a bunch of different materials. probably use 20 times the amount of steel pipes and steel beams purely because I use it for most recipes that require steel. So I love this recipe personally, but again, it does drain quite a lot of your iron resources. So far, we've discussed ways of saving copper and coal. But let's start combining a couple of these recipes now. Starting off with my go-to reinforced iron plate recipe, the stitched iron plates, which even just this recipe by itself without using the iron ingots is actually not too bad. Plates, okay, you're going to use a bit of iron, and wire, in theory, you're going to use a little bit of copper. This then saves you a bunch of iron if that is what you are trying to save. And we're actually using less than 200 iron ore, which is fantastic. So we combine the 188 iron ore with 108 water to make our 349 iron ingots. From that, we then split the iron ingots in two different directions. 200 iron ingots will then make the 133.4 plates, and 149 iron ingots will then make our iron wire. Again, we're using the regular plate recipe and iron wire. This then gives us 40 reinforced iron plates per minute, only consuming a bit of water. And again, this is like less than one extractor's worth of water, by the way, so it's kind of nothing. And 188 iron ore, which again is not too bad. I love this recipe, both with iron wire and also without iron wire, and I do actually recommend it. And this recipe combines everything together, not just with the reinforced iron plates, where again, you can save a bunch of copper, but also with the steel pipes, where you can save a bunch of coal. So you're saving two critical resources and you're substituting in a little bit of iron. Again, 45 iron is not too bad. 245 iron is a little bit steeper, obviously, but it's still not dreadful since you can actually make 18 modular frames just using some iron and a little bit of water there as well. You might remember a little bit earlier on, I was talking a little bit about steel pipe and how I like to use it for my encased industrial beam recipe. Well, this also relates back to modular frames, and in particular, the heavy modular frame. And that's because if you use this recipe right here, the heavy encased frame, look at the amount of items you need for this. Modular frame, as we know now, just consumes iron. Encased industrial beam just consumes iron and limestone if you use the recipe I recommend. Steel pipe just consumes iron, and of course concrete, it just consumes limestone and a little bit of water for each of these recipes if you so wish. Which means to make heavy modular frames, the only two items you need is limestone and iron, and water if you want to add that into the mix, which eventually ends up saving you tons of coal and tons of copper, again substituting in some iron, which I recommend. This is why I love iron recipes, but we're not done there just yet. Now we're moving on to rotors, and the funny thing about this recipe is that we're using steel pipes and wire, but we're not using any coal and copper because of the recipes we've already discussed. We've already been through iron wire and iron pipe, so I'm not going to talk about this for too long. But essentially, for less than 200 iron ore per minute, you can make 32 rotors. I think, in my opinion, that's a fantastic deal. And this recipe is also rather interesting. And that's to do with our stators, except this time, we can make 22 stators using 195 iron ore. And the best thing about this recipe is that it actually uses the exact same ingredients as our rotors. Here's a quick view of them side by side. Rotors need steel pipes and wire. Stator needs steel pipe and wire, and of course all the iron ingots and iron ore and water that's then needed for both. If only there was a recipe in this game that combines rotors and stators. Well, there is. And that leads us on to our final recipe of the video, motors, where you can use 180 iron ore and 103 water, and just by using that you can create 6 motors per minute. Because we used the fancy iron rotor recipe, you then make your iron pipes and your iron wire, and again, iron pipes, iron wire. Then you're using all of your iron ingots to then form your motors. This essentially combines almost everything we've talked about today, it throws it into one recipe, and it just proves how simple motors can be to make. Because again, you're saving a bunch of coal and a bunch of copper. If you would like to use coal and copper, that's completely fine, but this video is supposed to show you what can actually happen if you just use iron and a hint of water there on the side. It really can work wonders. But there's one thing I haven't actually mentioned in today's video, and in all honesty, it's one of the most important parts of the entire video itself, and that's logistic work and how easy it is to set up. Let's just go back to this motor recipe for a minute. What do you think as a player would be easier? Finding a cluster of iron and copper and coal next to the water preferably to make this factory, and then implementing all 3 of those items into a blueprint, let's say, or into a factory to then make all your motors, or just finding a bit of iron and water. In my opinion, logistically and of course fun-wise, this is far easier to set up. You don't have to use all the examples that I've showed in today's video. However, I just wanted to show you how easy it is to utilize iron. And of course, if you'd like to use the recipes, then feel free. Regardless, thank you again for all the support in the last couple of videos regarding the best recipe series. Series will continue. But regardless, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.